First, I want to tell you about the concept of objects and classes inside programming, and then we will dive into code and write our own classes and objects. In the real world, anything that you want to create has a blueprint. Let's say you want to build a house. When you look at the blueprint to build a house, you can understand what do you need to build a house, and it's in a structure to how to build it. In programming, classes are like blueprints. We can create objects from classes. Classes are just a blueprint, and objects are the things that we built from that blueprint. But since this is a digital world and we are not tied down to just physical stuff, we can create so many crazy things. For example, a blueprint to create a human. Also, objects in programming can have behavior. Our human has a bunch of parameters. For example, his height, the color of his eyes, his weight. And we can add behaviors, for example, for it to stand up or sit down or punch. These behaviors are methods that we have talked in the previous section. So now let's dive into code. Let's just start by creating a class called player. To create a class, just like methods, we can say public class and the name of the class, which in our case is player. Then two curly brackets, and here is our class. Let's say that we want to create a game and we assume it is multiplayer. So inside a game, we have multiple players. The parameters for our player, which each player is gonna have, one of them is the name, which is just like the variables that we have created until now. We just say public string name, and we will set a getter and setter. The getter and setter can be used as a method. Right now, the functionality is the default that the C# will give us by creating a value. Any value that we put into it will go through set, and when we want to get it, it will go through get. Alright, to the next parameter, each of our player gonna have a public int health with a getter and setter, and also each of our player gonna have an int damage. I want my players to have an ability as well. It's gonna be a special ability. Each ability gonna be different from each other. But it doesn't hide the fact that each of them has an ability. Each ability has their own set of parameters and behaviors. So here is what we're gonna do. We're gonna create a variable called public ability, and let's just call it ability with a getter and setter. Now I can see the type of ability is not available. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna create another class, public class ability, and we have created a public class ability, and the ability now can have their own sets of parameters, their own behaviors, and don't get confused by creating the ability inside the player. Because at the end of the day, what we are going to show the user is the calculation of some data. For example, when a player punches another player, we just calculate the distance between player 1 and player 2 is less than 1 meter, for example, and player 2 guard is not up, reduce the health of the player 2 by the amount of damage that the player 1 can have. So at the end of the day, all we do here are playing with data, so don't get confused by that. Now let's give our player a behavior. I want to create a public void punch. Let's open and close our parentheses and our curly brackets. Now each time our player throws a punch, I want to run a console.writeLine, and inside here I want to just say whoosh. Let's also create another behavior. Let's call it public void get punched, the parentheses and the curly brackets. Our get punch gonna get a value, which is an integer called damage. So when you get punched, I want to reduce the health. So we will say health gonna be minus equal the damage. And then let's console.write. Here you can see the autocomplete reading this for me, and I'm just gonna press tab. Let's add some text. Here I'm gonna say the name took this amount of damage and now have this amount of health. So this is how we can add a bunch of variables inside our text. We put a $sign before our double quotations for our string, and inside of it, any curly brackets that we open, we can put a value or we can write a code, and the result will be added inside our string. Now before we run and see the result, we need to first create a player. So to create a player, just like any variable, just like the ability that we have created, we're gonna say player and the name of the player, which let's just call it player1, gonna be equal to a new player. As I told you before, the player class here is a blueprint. So each time we're gonna create a new object of that blueprint, we're gonna say a new player. And when we say new player, our player will have a special space inside the memory of our computer. So the data that we have for player 1 and the data we have for player 2 will not get mixed up. Now, one way to give the parameter values to our player is by just saying player1.name. It can be John, and the player1.health can be 100, and it's one of the way that we can give value to our parameters. But the better way is by using a constructor. So let's go back into our class, and here if I write public player parentheses and curly brackets, you can see it's very much like a method, but it doesn't have a name, and the type also is the same as the type of our class. Well, it's because the constructor is basically a predefined method that each class can have. The purpose of the constructor is that when we create a new player, when we create an instance of the class that we have, the constructor will be run right away. So we do not need to call it like punch or get punched. And inside my constructor, what I want to do is to create a bunch of variables. So one of them is string name, the other one is int health, an int damage, and an ability called ability. It's because when I'm creating this player, I want to give all these values to my parameters. So now to actually give these values to our parameters, we need to say name is equal to name, which is a bit odd. The C# will know that this name is the one that we have created here, and this name is the one that we have created inside the constructor. But the better way is by saying this.name be equal to name. As you know, any variable that we create inside a method is only usable inside that method, and you cannot access it globally throughout our class. But when we say this.name, although the name of the variable is the same, the C# knows that it should go pick the variable that is inside the class. It's global. So now let's do this for other variables as well. This.health gonna be equal to health, this.damage gonna be equal to damage, and this.ability gonna be equal to ability. Now to give them the value that we want, here when we are creating an instance of the new player, we're just gonna give them the values inside the parentheses. So here I'm gonna say John and comma. Here you can see the values that it needs to create a new player, because these values are all required. But let's say that we want to give the ability of the user throughout the game, not at the start that the player has been created. You're gonna acquire that ability. So at the start, we can set the ability to Nullable. If you put a question mark after the type of the variable, it will become Nullable, so we can add null values to it. Now give the health 100, damage gonna be 10, and I can just set the ability to null. If I do not put the question mark here, when I say null, here you can see it is giving me a warning that cannot convert null to non-nullable reference type. So let's get that question mark back. And also in here, I should put the ability to Nullable. Alright, now it's time to test. Let's say our player 1 has throw some punches. So we'll say player1.punch, and just 2 more times. None of them hit another player, and the player 1.get punched. Alright, now the amount of damage that we have taken is 15. Maybe the level of that player in front of us is higher. Maybe the damage is higher and the health is lower. These are all the values that you can play with. Now if I run our application, alright, here you can see whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And after that you can see John took 15 damage and now have 85% health. If you want to support me to create more videos like this, please consider liking this video so YouTube can suggest this video to other people as well. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.